Okay. All right. I think we're ready to get started. Good evening to everyone. What an incredible crowd. On behalf of Beth Jacob, it's really my pleasure to welcome you all and thank you so much for joining us for what promises to be a really enlightening evening. This program is dedicated by the Chappelle family in memory of Fela and David Chappelle and in honor of David's 6th yahrzeit. We're so deeply saddened with the passing of Fela this past week, and we're still attempting to process the magnitude of the loss. Fela and David were true giants of our community who made such a profound impact upon Beth Jacob, Israel, the Jewish people that will be felt for generations. And Beth Jacob will be forever grateful to Fela and David Chappelle for helping build and grow the shul over the course of the decades and for being really exemplars of resilience, integrity, and generosity. And it's hard to see everyone joining here in the Zoom room, but I think I saw Rochelle join us just a couple of minutes ago. So I want to recognize the presence of Fela and David's daughter, Rochelle, who's joined us, and wish her our sincere condolences. I believe that Fela and David's granddaughter, Jennifer and Mark Smith, are also on the call. And so we wish the entire family our sincere condolences, and may the neshamot of Fela and David have an aliyah, and may their memory always serve as a blessing and inspiration to us all. So we've had the great honor of hosting Bret Stephens in a packed Chappelle sanctuary a couple of times. Our APAC delegation had the opportunity to arrange an exclusive session with him in DC at the policy conference. Bret, you might remember that too. And now to round out the venues, we're honored to host Bret by Zoom. And many of you have been avid readers of Bret's news columns over the years, and so you know that he is one of America's preeminent journalists who tackles complex global and domestic issues with logic, insight, and clarity. A Pulitzer Prize winner, he has served as editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, writer for the Wall Street Journal, is now an opinion columnist for the New York Times, and senior contributor to NBC News. Bret, it's a great honor to host you and to welcome you back to Beth Jacob. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. And it's a pleasure to hand it over to you. Bret is talking from Westchester, New York. I think you're on. I think you're good. I can't hear you. Let's see. I think you might be muted, Bret. Let's see. I have to unmute. Okay. Let's see. Hold on.
How's that?
There we go.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad we got over. Hopefully that'll be the only technical glitch of the evening. Well, I've been in your sanctuary at least a couple of times, Rabbi, so let me welcome you to mine. This is my slightly untidy study back here, and if any of you are worried about that gun, I sometimes am asked about it. It was made in Harper's Ferry in 1812, so I think it's fairly safe to say that it's a relic these days and poses no risk to anybody.
So it's great, Bret, that you've come to our home and now we're coming to your home. And I'm just jumping in here to also recognize the presence of Irv Chappelle, Fela and David's son Irv, and to thank Irv so much for joining us as well. And we wish our sincere condolences to Irv as well.
Well, I join you in my condolences. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the theme of the evening, which is Jews and power. I have learned over about a year of giving talks on Zoom that people's attention spans inevitably wane when they are in their living rooms. And so I hope to reserve a good balance of time for questions and answers. But let me first say a little bit about my theme, because I think it's relevant, and in a Jewish context, it's a difficult one. I think that it's fair to say that Jews are more comfortable talking about sex than they are talking about power for a whole host of reasons. But because of the position of the Jewish people in Israel, and increasingly the position of the Jewish people in the United States, it's important to be frank and thoughtful and judicious or at least as frank and thoughtful and judicious when talking about power as talking about any other subject. So let me take this up, first of all, in a foreign policy context or an Israel policy context, and then talk about issues that are a little closer to home. You know, it astounds me to think that we are now more than 27 years out from the 1993 Oslo Accords. And I'm guessing that everyone in this audience, except for perhaps a few young people, remember the Oslo Accords every bit as vividly as I do. And of course, that was a moment, a brief moment, shortly after the end of the Cold War and after the first Gulf War, when there was a great deal of optimism that Israel could finally make peace with its neighbors, and in particular with the Palestinians through that famous formula of land for peace. We now know, with the benefit of years of hindsight, how misjudged those hopes were. And it's important for us to think about why those hopes were misjudged, why the Oslo Accords failed. And the reason I'm talking about this is because we have a new set of accords called the Abraham Accords, which have been much more successful, I think are going to be much more successful, precisely because they think about the question of Jewish power in a fundamentally different way. So what was wrong with the Oslo Accords? Well, in theory, there was plenty that was, at least from abstractly, sound about them. The idea was that Israel's problem was that it had taken territory in 1967. All it had to do was give it back, and not only would a Palestinian state lead to peace in the region, but just as importantly for Israel, it would lead to Israel being once again loved by the nations. So there was a psychological gambit, psychological bet inscribed in the heart of the Oslo Accords, which is that if you took conspicuous risks for peace, if you demonstrated your magnanimity, if you made a bid for the world's love, then the world would love you in return, even if, from an objective, strategic, and military point of view, you were becoming weaker as a result. The idea was that by trading hard power, the hard power of territory, the hard power of military advantage, for soft power, which in this case was something approaching international respectability or popularity, Israel would come out as the beneficiary. Now, I think it's fair to say, looking back on what happened, that Israel's hopes were not met, and the failure was not the result of Israel not being ready to make sacrifices of one kind or another for peace. The problem was that the more that Israel gained, the more emboldened its enemies among the Palestinians in the Arab world and its critics throughout the rest of the world, in Europe and the United States, the more emboldened they became. Showing weakness was not an avenue. Showing political weakness did not turn out to be an avenue for gaining the world's love. It turned out to be a vehicle for losing the world's respect. Because what Israel had had prior to 1993, on account of its military victories, was that it had the world's respect. And that began to wane. And as a result, Israel went through 7 very bad years following the breakdown of the Oslo Accords, the Second Intifada, and the 2006 Lebanon War. So I think of that as a predicate to what is happening now with a very different set of accords, which are the Abraham Accords. I think I don't need to say this to anyone in this Zoom talk what they are. It's Israel's peace with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, very likely as well with Sudan, with Morocco, probably quite soon with Oman, and ultimately perhaps with Saudi Arabia itself, which would mean that the most important countries in the Arab world, the most important country in the Arab world, Saudi Arabia, might, within the space of a few years, make peace with the Jewish state. And that is just an extraordinary thing when you think about it. I mean, for years, everyone talked about the Arab-Israeli conflict as not just intractable, but almost a metaphor for everything that was intractable, everything that was unsolvable, everything that was difficult in global affairs. I remember an old joke was, well, if you just solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, you might be able to solve global warming as well. And now, suddenly, quite abruptly and unexpectedly, you have a very real prospect of this happening, never mind within our lifetime, but within the next year or so. So it behooves us to think why the Abraham Accords seem to be so successful, where the Oslo Accords were such a failure. Well, you would think that the Abraham Accords would never have come about. Just a few years ago, John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, gave a talk in which he said, you know, I sometimes hear people say that Israel doesn't have to make peace with the Palestinians. They can just go and make peace with the Arab states, and then the Palestinian issue will be resolved separately. And then Kerry went on to say, no, 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 and no, and no, and no, and no. Right? This was a conventional wisdom just about 4 or 5 years ago, which tells you something about what John Kerry understood about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But the more important fact is that these accords are taking place after 12 years of Benjamin Netanyahu being continuously in power, allegedly that hard right-wing anti-peace figure. They're taking place after Israel has waged 3 successive wars against aggression coming from Gaza. They're taking place amidst a backdrop of Israel having made really no concessions whatsoever to the Palestinians in any form of negotiation. On the contrary, not only has Israel responded to aggression in Gaza, but it is waging continuous warfare, low-level warfare against Iranian assets and Hezbollah assets in Lebanon and in Syria and even in Iraq. Israel is now stronger, tougher, and more adamant in maintaining its security than it ever has been before. And lo and behold, these 2 key Arab states are looking at Israel not necessarily with love, but with something that is foundational for any successful form of love, and that's respect. They have learned that in their region, there is one country that they can lean on as a reliable ally, and it's not the United States. They have learned that in their region, experiencing social and economic collapse, there is one country that points the way toward a better type of future, and it's not the Palestinian Authority, it's Israel. And suddenly the Arab world is looking on Israel because it was strong, because it stood up against its enemies and its critics. The Arab world is looking on Israel with respect. And it's leading to this extraordinary series of peace agreements, which I think in time might, maybe, hopefully, who knows, actually end up leading a critical mass of Palestinians to realize that their future does not lie in perpetual conflict with Israel, but rather their future lies in making some kind of accommodation, reaching an acceptance of the reality and permanence of a Jewish state as their neighbor in perpetuity. So I want to raise this from the beginning as a good example of why it matters that when we think about Israel, we realize that the worst thing to wish on Israel is weakness for the sake of popularity. We should wish it strength for the sake of respect. Now let me move the discussion to a slightly more domestic but still international angle, which is the question of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and the Biden administration's desire to come back into its fold, into its terms. Now, here's another thing that I think a lot of Jews are very uncomfortable noting. The Biden administration is the most Jewish administration, I think, in American history. It is a striking fact. The chief of staff to the president, Ron Klain, is Jewish. The Secretary of State to the president, Antony Blinken, is Jewish. The Secretary of Homeland Security is Jewish. The Attorney General, or the incoming Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, is Jewish. The Senate Majority Leader is Jewish. I think this is an extraordinary testament to what American Jews have been able to achieve in our own promised land here in the United States, and why we feel why being American and being an American Jew is such an extraordinary part of the historical Jewish experience. And it's just something that's worth noting and celebrating. And none of us should say that because these leading figures are Jewish, they are obliged to arrange their political thinking according to parochial Jewish lights. They're Americans first and foremost. They're going to be loyal servants and assistants to the president, and that's fine. But it is a question for, I think, the larger Jewish community, how we think about power and influence. Now, there are two ways of the Jewish community having influence in the United States, especially when it comes to issues that matter that matter a lot to us as an organized community or as individual Jews. One way is to simply want to be on the side of power, whoever happens to be in power. This is what I call the invitation to the White House Hanukkah party version of American Jewish political influence, right? And that's great. I mean, it's wonderful that there's a Hanukkah party every year, and presidents of both parties attend it. And it's natural that people people should want to feel some sort of proximity with those who are in power. But if the American Jewish community has acquired influence, has acquired economic power, has acquired political power in the last 200 years, and certainly in the last 50 or 60 years, we have to ask ourselves, is the purpose of that power simply to be on the side of power, whoever it is, whatever it is, or is it to actually influence administrations, influence the people in power for what we think of as our core issues? And this is going to come to a head very soon when it comes to the inevitable fight that is going to happen over returning to the Iran nuclear deal. In 2015, a great many people said, do not oppose the Obama administration. It is adamant. It sees the JCPOA as its foreign policy legacy. Don't burn your bridges with an American president. Don't burn your bridges with the Democratic Party. Let's keep our reservations about the JCPOA private. I think today, that's the same question that many of us, especially those of us who think about public policy and try to influence public policy, may be asking ourselves. And the argument I would make is, again, American Jews have not had this kind of success over the last 200 years and acquired this kind of influence simply to bid for, or simply to make a momentary bid for popularity. The use of power is also to say, on some issues, we have to take a stand. And there is a reason why there is a near uniformity of opinion among Israelis, among Arabs, that a return to the JCPOA, given what we know about Iran's behavior, given their experience of using the relief of sanctions to perpetrate mischief and chaos across the region, that a return to the JCPOA would be disastrous for Israel and would be disastrous for the interests of the United States worldwide. That's my view, and that's one of the reasons why I think that American Jews are better served, if you believe the JCPOA is a bad idea, as I do, to speak up candidly and forthrightly about why it's such a misbegotten enterprise, why the Biden administration would be so mistaken in trying to re-enter it. So again, it's the question of hoping for the world's love by refusing to use power, or demanding public respect and political respect by using the power that you have. Now, the final point I want to make is about Jews and cultural power. And this is where I find myself very alarmed about what I think is a precarious status for American Jewry in 2021. I think most of you are probably aware of some of the controversy that went with what began as a blatantly anti-Semitic curriculum, ethnic studies curriculum for California public schools. That was fortunately, the original version of it was fortunately vetoed by your governor, Gavin Newsom. Now there's a new version of it, which emphasizes Jews as a racial group, Jews with Middle Eastern background, Sephardic Jews, and so on. But all of this is part of a broad and very rapid shift in American culture, where American Jews are no longer seen as an ethnic group that has, or a religious group that has historically experienced discrimination and challenges in the United States, that has been victimized not only here, but throughout the world. But instead, Jews are being treated by a new philosophy, a new progressive philosophy based on something called critical race theory, based on something called intersectionality, as a privileged, white, and inherently oppressive group. If you haven't been following these debates in the last 4 or 5 years, you might not be aware that a cultural revolution is taking place in this country with as much speed and severity as the cultural revolution that this country experienced in the late 1960s. Maybe one reason you don't notice it is that there's been a cultural revolution, but everyone is wearing the same clothes. I guess people are wearing sweatpants these days, although I promise you I'm not. But a revolution has taken place. And in the intersectional pyramid, where people supposedly earn social cachet or prestige by belonging to an ever-increasing group, a list of allegedly or actually victimized groups, Jews are faring very poorly on this list. You will increasingly hear terms like privilege, as in check your white privilege or check your economic privilege. And the concept of privilege on the surface may sound like a legitimate concept, but it behooves all of us who are Jews to remember that the privileged Jews of 1920s Weimar Germany became the victims of concentration camps within the space of just 1 or 2 years after 1933. So the idea that privilege, quote unquote privilege, means that Jews ought to be looked at with suspicion socially and culturally is a dangerous idea. And that idea is now abroad, afoot. It's increasingly part of the cultural landscape. It's part of what many of your children or grandchildren are learning in high schools and universities. And it is dangerous to the American Jewish community. Now, again, the Jewish community here in the United States faces a choice. We can be as quiet as we can. We can try to find areas of agreement when it comes to the struggle for civil rights. We can hope to be inconspicuous. We can denounce anti-Semitism on the right, and Lord knows that there's plenty of anti-Semitism on the right. We can do all sorts of things to try to be good allies, groups that are marginalized or have been historically oppressed. And that's one way of doing it. It is what Winston Churchill once called feeding the crocodile in the hopes that it eats you last. But if we go down that road, if we try to bid for the love of a progressive left, which is building an ideology and a philosophy which is inherently hostile to the long-term interests of the Jewish people, we will suffer. We will suffer just as much as we did when we tried to bid for the world's love through the Oslo Accords and ended up instead in the reign of terror that was the Second Intifada. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to say that, of course, the Jewish people have always stood up for fundamental human rights. It is intrinsic to our tradition. In fact, we are the founders of a tradition that has always emphasized that man is made, that human beings are made in the image of God. This is foundational to all of Western civilization, and it's something we can be tremendously proud of. But we also have to insist as individuals and communities that we cannot simply go along with a creeping illiberalism, particularly on the American left, and not note how dangerous this is to us for all that we have achieved as a community in the United States, and all that we stand for as believers in the founding promise of America as a land of equality, a land of opportunity, and a land where people are ultimately judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin or their ethnic background or their makeup. So I think that's the other fight that many of us are going to be waging in the years ahead. And the first thing I would do is urge you to just be aware of what the stakes are, because they're real, they're very serious, and as they say, they're coming for you. You know, I'll finish with this remark. There was a beautiful book I read a few years ago by a now deceased German historian named Joachim Fest, who grew up as a Catholic boy in Berlin in the 1920s and 30s, but had the blessing of a father who was a philo-Semite and a committed anti-Nazi. And the book is the story of really the suffering his family endured by refusing to bend the knee to the Third Reich. But there's a beautiful passage in the book where the father, who's the hero of the story, talks about the German Jewish community and how much admiration he had for that community. And remember, this was a community that had thrived as in no other country in Europe, much as the American Jewish community has thrived in the United States. And the son quotes the father extolling the wisdom and perspicacity and culture and cultural savvy of the Jews. And then he says, but they had just one failing, which is that having grown up in liberal, tolerant Prussia, they had lost their instinct for danger that had preserved them through the ages. The Jewish community always does best when we preserve our instinct for danger. So I'm going to conclude with that slightly grim, but I think useful thought that in these days especially, let's maintain our instinct for danger, and let's insist, first of all, before we ask for anybody's love, that they give us their respect. I'm going to stop there and just thank you very much for listening in.
Hey, thank you, Bret, so much for that excellent presentation. That was really fascinating and great. Just reminds me of the story of Purim, of course, which is coming up in just a few days, where Mordechai and Esther were Jews in power. And that came with many risks, but ultimately they saved the people. And there was a time where they were humble about their identity, but then they knew that there were times where they needed to rise to the occasion and speak truth to power and stand up and speak out. So what you spoke about really hits home to some of the themes of this upcoming holiday. A lot of questions came in, so I was trying to concentrate on your talk and ask questions coming in. Let's see if we could do this together. Bret, you're welcome to also look at the chat box. Here from Lenin Frida Korupkin, how much is BLM, Black Lives Matter, contributing to the anti-Jewish attitudes you described so eloquently? Can you tell us a little bit about BLM, and is it fundamentally problematic? Is it just certain elements of Black Lives Matter, and how are they contributing to the anti-Jewish attitudes that you just described?
Well, BLM is a large group, and there are a lot of people who are in the movement who are not anti-Semitic. It's not about Jews. It's about Black lives, and a lot of people who are consider themselves allies of the movement. And I think it's absolutely the case that as Jews, we need to be alert to the fact that too much of Black America, way too much of Black America, feels fundamentally marginalized by society. So that's a real issue. And to the extent that BLM has been able to capture people's imagination, I think that's all to the good. The problem is that there is an illiberal current in simply saying that one group matters, and that to even suggest, people are losing their jobs and have lost their jobs by saying things like all lives matter, as if that is somehow antithetical to the interests of Black lives. And so, leaving aside the particular questions of what someone in BLM has said about Jews or hasn't said about Jews, there is an illiberal strain in the movement that I think is concerning. So, I'm very leery about tarring an entire group by the behavior of one or two of its, or not one or two, but a handful of its members, right? And I think we should be any of us who belong to a large organization of any stripe know that there are going to be people who are going to say things that appear to embarrass the organization or tar the organization. But yes, when the whole point of the whole game of playing politics as a matter of separating identities rather than emphasizing basic common human interests is something that should alarm us. And it is part of an identitarian, illiberal strain in American politics that worries me. And that's also part of a kind of a larger culture of dividing people up according to skin color, economic class, and so on.
Back on the issue relating to Israel and the Abraham Accords, and I read your excellent article in the Commentary magazine in the February edition, which bring to people's attention that Bret wrote an article in the recent Commentary. So a question that came up on the chat is, what are your thoughts, Bret, about the idea that Israel may share sensitive information in terms of technologies with their new Abraham Accords partners, only to have those partners use that against Israel in the future? And I guess the larger question of how much can we trust these nations as we try to develop a relationship with these countries? Can you speak to that and where that relationship is going?
Well, a glib answer would be trust but verify, since we were earlier talking about my admiration for Ronald Reagan, and that's certainly a pretty good model. Look, I think the practical aspect of that question is, for instance, what what attitude should Israel, or for that matter, American lawmakers take to, say, the sale of F-35 jets to the United Arab Emirates. And my view is that we should support it. First of all, the Israeli government supports it. Second of all, these jets only really work if they are maintained. It's not like once you get an F-35, it's yours to fly in perpetuity. All aircraft require spare parts, require software upgrades, and so on. So I don't think there is a terrible risk that they will ever be used against Israel. And finally, look, we need to make good on, Israel needs to make good on the promise of that partnership. Because it's not just that Israel stood up for itself, demanded the Arab world's respect, and the Arab world came around. The Arab world is changing too. And the most sweeping changes, or the most dramatic changes, are being spearheaded in the United Arab Emirates. I'm sure there are people in on this call who have traveled throughout the Middle East and understand that, you know, a place like Dubai looks a hell of a lot different from, say, Cairo or Amman. This is a forward-looking country that is trying to create a new model for what an Arab state should look like. And if a Palestinian state is ever to come into existence, we should all hope that it looks to Abu Dhabi or Dubai as a model for what it should be. There is no reason we should subject the Palestinians to what George Bush used to call the soft bigotry of low expectations. There's no reason why a Palestinian state, if it makes the right choices, can't look more like Dubai than Beirut. And so for the Arab world to have a viable model among its 22 member states, I think that's a good thing. And by the way, since I raised the issue of Iran, Israel is going to need capable partners in the Arab world to face up to Iranian imperialism in the region.
Is it likely that President Biden will try and return to the situation where Israel exchanges military power for soft power and respect by giving land to the Palestinians, meaning moving away from what you're talking about? Where do we see President Biden and his administration on that issue?
Well, you know, I hope they don't. I was telling some people earlier that, you know, when you play the same moves with the same chess pieces, you're going to get the same result. So if President Biden is going to send his Secretary of State for weeks on end to try to arrange a negotiation between President Abbas, who's now in the 17th year of his 4-year term of office, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's going to lead absolutely nowhere. In fact, the last time Secretary Kerry tried to do that in 2014, what it led to was another war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. You know, one of the points that I think is very important is that the Biden administration needs to de-link, to separate Israeli-Arab progress in the Israeli-Arab sphere from progress in the Israeli-Palestinian sphere. There is an American interest in resolving the Israeli-Arab conflict. That is a real national interest for us in the United States. Why? Because so many times in the past, whether it was 1956 or 1973 or 1991, conflict between Israelis and Arabs was a foreign policy crisis for the United States. The Palestinian issue is a purely local conflict. And if you want to talk about conflicts in terms of the scale of humanitarian disaster or the strategic importance of resolving them, it is a trivial conflict by comparison to, say, what's happening in Syria or Yemen or any number of places. So it would be wonderful to see an American administration simply say to the Palestinians, when you get serious about accepting having a Jewish state as a neighbor forever, then give us a call. And until then, we have more important issues to deal with.
A question that just came in is, do you think Bibi can repair his relationship and influence with Biden after he embarrassed President Obama by talking to Congress, not the president? Actually, I was thinking a similar thing in terms of, Bret, you talking about our need to, you know, demand respect and speak about our convictions when necessary, even when it's difficult and even when it's not popular. I was actually curious in terms of your thoughts about, Bibi. This is, I guess, history, but a few years ago, a number of years ago, when Bibi came to Congress, was that a wise move? Was that a dumb move? And did that cause, was that, Bibi standing up strong for what we believe in about the JCPOA deal and the problems with it, or was it something that caused a partisan divide and a rift that had, kind of pushed away the Democratic Party?
Well, it's an excellent question. I'm glad you're asking it, because remember, at the time, the standard view among many people, including, I think, many people in the Jewish community, was, oh my goodness, Bibi is creating a rift with the Democratic Party, and how dare you insult the king? And this is a disaster. 6 years later, I think that proved to be a very canny move on his part, not because he was speaking to Congress, but because he was speaking to the Arab ambassadors who were watching, not in the gallery, but were watching on their TV screens and cheering him. And this is a point that I've noticed in private conversations with many leading Arab figures, that they felt that in 2015, Benjamin Netanyahu was speaking for them. They didn't quite have what they felt was the political clout to oppose the Obama administration, but Bibi had the nerve to go to Congress and make a forthright case for why the Iran nuclear deal was such a bad deal, and why there was a better one. So in fact, that's another perfect illustration of what happens when you actually insist on respect rather than just trying to get along. Look, I've known Bibi for 20 years, okay? He's a difficult guy. He has many virtues. He has many flaws. So does everyone. So do we all. And most grown-ups, especially grown-ups in politics, understand that you have to separate the personalities of the people you're dealing with from questions of core interest. The great challenge for the Biden administration is not how it's going to separate itself from the Trump administration. Everyone knows it's going to be separate from the Trump administration. The great challenge is how it's going to separate itself from the Obama administration. And if Biden cannot learn to avoid the mistakes of the Obama administration, and there were many, he's going to run into the same kind of trouble. Remember, when Obama left office, we had a resurgent ISIS. We had an Arab world in chaos. We had traditional American allies, whether it was Jerusalem or Riyadh or Cairo, angry with the United States. And we had an Iranian nuclear deal that was turbocharging the Iranian economy and allowing it to sow mayhem and chaos in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, elsewhere, and in Iraq. That was not a successful policy. So just because to many people, Trump made everyone else seem kind of good in comparison, doesn't mean that the right answer is just to sort of go back to 2016 and act as if nothing has changed. Things have changed, and I should hope Biden is going to be his own man when it comes to foreign policy.
One question that was asked was, do you give the Trump administration any credit for the Abraham Accords? And I'll add to that, President Trump and his administration made many moves over the course of his presidency, of course, declaring Jerusalem as the capital, moving the embassy there, declaring sovereignty, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and pulling out of the JCPOA. Is it, as a Jewish community, whatever our opinion is of Trump in general, is it something that we should appreciate his moves as strengthening the place of Israel? Some have argued that no, that his moves, because of other considerations and because it's so opposed and rejected by the Democrats, that his standing in the outside world, that his support of Israel is not as impactful as perhaps we think. What's your thoughts about giving the Trump administration credit for the Abraham Accords and gratitude for their moves in support of Israel?
Look, I mean, 2 points. everyone I know thinks of me as a never Trumper, but in truth, if you followed my column over the last 4 years, I always gave the Trump administration credit when I thought it had done the right thing. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem was morally the right thing. And guess what? The Arab world didn't rise in revolt against Israel or against the United States for doing that. It would be insane for Israel to even consider ever returning the Golan Heights to Syria. And what a good thing it was back in 1999, 2000, when it was being negotiated, that negotiation failed, because otherwise Israel would have had ISIS up on the heights throughout the Syrian civil war. It was absolutely right to exit from the JCPOA, especially after the Mossad caper, in which the Israelis stole tens of thousands of documents, proved that Iran had been cheating on the deal from the very beginning, because it had just simply refused to acknowledge its past weaponization work. So I've always given Trump credit for all of those things. I have other objections, but again, so those of you maybe who are a little older and maybe a little more liberal, you might not have liked Richard Nixon, but you probably don't object to the Environmental Protection Agency or other things the Nixon administration did that you agree with. And we're sophisticated people. We should be able to say, I don't like X, Y, and Z, and those are dispositive. But at the same time, I can walk and chew gum. I can also recognize that in certain areas, the Trump administration did the right thing. And in many areas of Middle Eastern policy, they did well. I would like to add that it was partly for taking my advice, but that's a self-serving point. So I'll leave that in parentheses.
But Bret, on that thing, in terms of appreciating or recognizing his good moves, but that kind of gets to nuance, and that's it's hard for our community sometimes and our country to have nuance, and that gets to Dan Stone's question, which is, what is your view on the partisan divide in the Jewish community, and how do we get back to a point where we could treat one another as human beings, as Jews, as recognizing that what brings us together is much, much more than what separates us? How do we address what can you tell us about the partisan divide from your perspective of the Jewish community?
Well, look, things go wrong in society when people start making personal judgments based exclusively on how someone else votes. And I've always, obviously there are cases where if you support a neo-Nazi or something horrible, one has to sort of render a sweeping personal judgment. But the idea that you can never break bread with someone who voted for the other guy is insane and dangerous and bad for democracy. I gave a lecture about 4 years ago in Sydney called The Dying Art of Disagreement. And part of the problem that we have in America today is that we scream at each other a lot. And in fact, we're screaming so loudly, we almost never bother to hear what the other person is saying. It's like one of those knockdown marital arguments where your voices are so loud that it's no one understands what the other is saying. And we should at least spend some time trying to understand the other side as they see themselves, and not as a caricature that just flatters our own view of how we see them. That's something that's been lost, and I think it's been lost because of social media. It's been lost because of the echo chamber of Fox News versus MSNBC and people only listening to others who agree with them. I think one thing that could help a lot is by simply cultivating debate and argument and a clash of views as part of a healthy media diet. And that goes beyond just sort of reading Bret Stephens and Nick Kristof in the pages of the New York Times. It has to involve, Nick's a friend of mine, but it has to involve an actual contest of ideas, actual exchange of views. That's not happening nearly as much as it should. But it begins by saying to yourself, just because my neighbor voted for the other candidate does not make him a horrible human being. And people have trouble doing that these days.
So if we just drill down on that a little bit, the question came into me personally, as someone whose pro-Israel bona fides are without question, and who is not a Trump supporter, what would you say to those who chose to vote for Trump? And that gets into in terms of the exchange of ideas, and what do you say, and what do you hear? So what would you say to those who chose to vote for Trump?
It's a free country. I mean, what am I supposed to say? People are allowed to vote for the candidate of their choice, and I typically don't assume that if someone has voted for Trump, it's that they voted for Trump's worst aspects, right? Most people who voted for Trump didn't say, well, the guy's a jerk and he didn't run his businesses particularly well, and that's why I'm voting for him. Most of the Trump supporters I know say the guy is a jerk and problematic in many respects, but on issues that matter to me, like whatever, the Middle East or the economy or regulation, I think he was better than Hillary or better than Joe Biden, right? That's fine. Look, as a columnist, it's in the nature of being a columnist that you have to seem to be a little more confident in your views than you should be, right? It's in the nature of being a thoughtful human being that you have to always remind yourself that you could be wrong about many issues. And in fact, you're most likely to be wrong about the issues in which you feel a fair degree of certitude or certainty. And so I always try to sort of have that in the back of my mind whenever I'm exchanging views. What I would say is that, in my opinion, America does better in the world when we lead, above all, with our idealism and our commitment to an open society and liberal democratic values. And that's why I always objected to the whole concept of America first. And of course, America first, and that we're Americans. But America will not lead if it's not able to inspire other countries to follow. And I wonder how many other countries we inspired to follow in the last 4 years. America is not going to win if we view foreign policy as a transactional matter, which we just happen to be the biggest dog on the block and therefore can get our way. So, and above all, America is not going to win in the long term if we don't stick to principles of opportunity, openness, and a willingness to engage the world, which used to be the hallmarks of the conservatism I grew up with when Ronald Reagan turned me on to being a conservative, and that's still the guy I think I hope I am.
Just one more word about you've spoken about the Iran and the threat that they pose to the world. Theodore asks, Iran has greatly enriched their nuclear reserves since the agreement ended. If you're not in favor of a new agreement, then what should be our approach?
Well, I'm in favor of a much tougher agreement.
Okay.
Look, two things. Iran is a very dangerous country. It's a dangerous country that uses barbaric practices to try to get its way, including taking American citizens hostage all the time, including using terrorism and policy by atrocity to get its way in places like Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and so on. And it's a country that shouldn't be allowed to get within 100 miles of nuclear weapons, let alone have them, around the block now that they're manufacturing uranium metal. So the Biden administration would be insane not to say and actually mean that a military option has to be somewhere on the table. At the same time, let me just offer a little factoid. At least the last I checked, although it might have changed because of oil prices, the Iranian economy, with north of 80 million people, is about the same size as the economy of greater Philadelphia. Okay, so take Philly plus Wilmington and maybe Allentown, and that's Iran, economically speaking. And the idea that we can't bring tremendous pressure to bear on that regime so that they are put to a fundamental choice between having an economy or having a nuclear program, but not both. The idea that we can't bring that kind of diplomatic and economic pressure is just mistaken. We have not exhausted diplomacy. We never put the Iranians to that choice. And I think the smart move for the Biden administration is to say, here's the deal, as Joe Biden would say, you are going to abandon the following things, like your centrifuge enrichment, like plutonium reprocessing, like enriching uranium beyond the civilian threshold and so on, like your missile programs, like your other armaments programs. And once you've done that, we're willing to talk. Until then, not only do the Trump sanctions stay, but in fact, we're going to make them tougher. That's the way to a successful negotiation. If instead it becomes a policy of preemptive concession making, we're on a bad road.
Okay, back to there's a two-front cultural war, the radicalization of the right, some of those Camp Auschwitz, those horrific T-shirts at the Capitol, and of the liberal left. How can we take stands without being canceled and how do we maximize our impact? And in a related sense, what Johnny asks, which is, can you please comment on the relative dangers of the ultra-left and the ultra-right?
Well, if you know your history of the Weimar Republic, both are dangerous. And my advice is always that if you find yourself on the political right, be more vigilant about the extremism of the right. And if you're on the political left, be more vigilant about the extremism of the left. The temptation is always that if you're on the right, you complain about Antifa, and if you're on the left, you complain about the right-wing lunatics. It would be better if each side policed itself. Look, what happened on January 6th was more than just a national disgrace. It was, to me, a validation of why I took the position I did in 2016 of opposing Trump. Because Trump did more than just give a speech on January 6th, which incited a mob. He spent 2 months lying about the election, and being refuted by every court and every judge in every jurisdiction that he tried to turn to. And that was illiberal and really a moment of genuine danger, not just for Mike Pence or for the other members who were threatened, but a moment of danger for American government. We need to be serious about dealing with that. And by the way, I would add, all of us who have sort of followed Islamic extremism for many years know that it's not just a matter of the terrorists who are blowing themselves up that we need to worry about. We need to worry about the ideological inspiration behind the terrorists, the Sayyid Qutbs, who provided the intellectual foundation for the Osama bin Ladens. So on the right, we need to do that too. What is this ecosystem of conspiracy thinking, QAnon beliefs, the militias, this kind of Manichaean view that if the left takes over, America is finished? What is the ecosystem? Where is that coming from? I'm not saying shut it down. This is still a free country and crazy views are going to have to exist, but we have to do something about it. And by the way, there is a similar pattern on the left. There are two parties in America today. They're not Republican and Democratic. They are liberal and illiberal. And the Republican Party has liberal sides. That is to say, they're basically committed to constitutional government, the Bill of Rights, and so on. And there's an illiberal side that isn't committed to it and wanted to overturn the results of an election. And the same pattern is unfolding on the left as well. So what I would say is, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, pro-choice or pro-life, higher taxes or lower taxes, just be on the liberal side of American politics, and when it comes to standing for basic constitutional and liberal and democratic principles.
Hey, Bret, our time is winding down and it's getting late on the East Coast. I want to ask you a few quick questions and maybe give brief answers to them. Do you see AOC and the squad growing in power in the Democratic Party? Another question asked by one of our financial experts, Martin Shandling. Can we ask Bret his opinion on the minimum wage debate in the US, which flies in the face of traditional established economic theory? which calls for market forces of supply and demand to determining price. So minimum wage debate question. And then a question from Mark Rohatner, but I think this might be from Lynn. Does Biden have all his marbles? Who is controlling his administration? But I won't presume whether it's from Mark or Lynn. But anyway, those are a few. Maybe we'll end with, there's a few others that are coming in. Here, one more. If you believe that the ascendant left is the McCarthyism of our time, how can it be stopped when the left increasingly controls the levers of power in social, cultural, economic, and political institutions? All right, so those are several questions. I'm sorry to those whose questions we weren't able to address. I think we got many of them or most of them. Bret, maybe you could address with what we say, AOC, minimum
so
wage.
AOC, I jotted this down. Is she the ascendant in the party? Well, I hope not. And listen, people who are worried about the radicalism of the Democratic Party, as I am, should remember that in 2020, the most moderate person on the stage, except for maybe Mike Bloomberg, turned out to be the nominee. It wasn't Bernie. And I hope it's not going to be AOC. We'll see. I mean, but I guess my answer is I hope not. Minimum wage, the correct minimum wage is 0. And so any of you who are wondering about, where I stand politically, I mean, obviously, I don't think people should be paid $0. I think it's just economically foolish to price people who are at the margins of the labor market from having jobs, right? And by the way, that was, I should add, the official position of the New York Times' editorial board back in 1987, and it remains mine today. Does Biden have all his marbles? I hope so, and I have no reason not to assume. I remember these questions always used to be asked of Ronald Reagan, but the person I saw perform in those debates, and those were not pre-scripted, not just the 2 debates with Trump, but the many debates before then, was certainly able to hold his own. So I hope, I wish him nothing but the best. America needs, after more than 30 years, to have a successful presidency. We've not had a truly successful presidency in 30 years. It's an astonishing fact. The ascendant left, that's the last question, and maybe a good one to end on. If the left doesn't heal itself, if the left doesn't turn away from a kind of proto-totalitarian progressivism that is kind of banging on its door, if the left abandons its core liberal values, it's not going to be just, it's going to be devastating for the left itself, because there are many people who are liberal who are kind of being driven out of the arms of liberalism. And it's going to be devastating for the United States too. And I think the right answer, perhaps, I mean, I'm thinking out loud, is that new institutions, academic institutions, cultural institutions, media institutions, have to be invented, created, funded, and so on, to create an ecosystem which is not right-wing, but just believes in the inherent value of genuine intellectual viewpoint diversity, genuine moral tolerance, a belief in the importance of gadflies and real dissidents, or at least heterodox thinkers, as essential parts of a healthy ecosystem in a free society. So who's doing that work? And how can it be done? I think that's a great question for people to start thinking about kind of on an urgent basis, because otherwise the country is going to be in trouble. We are creating a generation of people whose thought patterns are eerily resemblant or eerily resemble the thought patterns of the kind of totalitarian movements that destroyed Europe in the early 20th century. So we need to be really careful when we're dividing up the country according to identity, according to race, according to economic status. That's That's destructive of what the United States is all about. We need to be really careful when the penalty for saying the wrong thing is reputational annihilation on social media. We need to be really careful when we are suppressing dissident voices at universities that are making points that just 10 years ago would have seemed innocuous and now are considered beyond the pale. If you care about liberal society in the broad sense, the old-fashioned sense, now is the time to take care. It's a kind of a grim thought to end on. So what I'd like to say is I wish I were in California, because right outside my window here, there are about 3 feet of snow, and I'm sick of it. And I can't wait for this pandemic to end so that I can visit all of my friends over there in LA in person. And I just want to thank you as just an amazing Jewish community, a beautiful Jewish community. My mother is a graduate of Beverly Hills High School in 1958. She was a classmate of Nora Ephron. California holds a special place in our family's in our family history. So I always miss you, and I wish it were as warm here as it is over there.
Okay, Bret, this was really amazing. You gave us so much to think about and to process. And Bret, we look forward to welcoming you and hosting you back in person at Beth Jacob in the near future, and we'll allow you to enjoy the LA weather. And thank you so much for this evening, sharing your time and your great wisdom together with all of us. Keep up the great work that you're doing, and thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for joining us, and hope that you enjoyed the evening. All the best, everyone.